Today on the PIO podcast, we'd like to welcome back Jeff Wenninger, retired from LAPD and the CEO of Law Enforcement Consultants. Jeff, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Jeff, we had you earlier on this year. We had a phenomenal discussion about policing and the stressors that are put on officers. Today, we're going to be discussing your most recent book release, On Thin Ice. But before we dive deeply into this, I'd like to ask a real quick couple questions here. Your entry into policing wasn't traditional. You intended to be a professor. Why you chose to go into law enforcement and from being a professor?
Well, I initially was a finance major in college, and then I had an experience with the police, and I can go into that in great detail if you'd like. But it was that experience that changed my trajectory initially by me taking a few criminal justice classes and finding that I had an interest in it. And it was that experience, which I'll go into in detail. I was a Division I college hockey player, played Division I college hockey on scholarship. And Labor Day weekend, I went out with one of my teammates, have a few beers. And when the bar closed, everybody was, all the students were flowing out the side doors onto the sidewalk that was not meant to hold the capacity of students that were flowing out on the sidewalk. So many of us ended up in the street, and there was this car full of nice looking young ladies trying to get through the crowd. And my buddy thought he'd be cute, and he propped himself up on the hood of the car. And when she slammed on the brakes, he went falling off the hood. And to date myself a little bit, he grabbed the antenna that was on the hood and snapped it off. So there was a police officer just up the street, and he saw the whole thing occur. And he came and he grabbed my buddy and threw him in the back seat of the police car in handcuffs. So I'm like, well, I need to find out where they're taking him, how long it's going to take him to process him, and how much I'm going to have to pay to bail him out of jail. So when I approached the police officer, he was very belligerent and made it very clear that I was going to go to jail as well if I didn't get back up on the sidewalk. And I had a few beers, but I had my wits about me. I knew I'd better get back up on the sidewalk, and I did as I was instructed. So it wasn't long before two more officers showed up, and the initial officer pointed directly at me. And as they approached, they walk up and use an expletive and say, let's see your identification, you blank, blank, blank. And as I'm reaching for my identification, they proceeded to beat me. And it wasn't long before I was in handcuffs in the backseat of the police car on my way down to the city jail. And I was booked in for disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and interfering in official business. So I'm like, this is crazy. But to make it even crazier, I'm down there. I'm like, where's my buddy? And they're like, we let him go. Like, so my buddy did something that he thought would be cute. He gets handcuffed initially. I inquire about his, what his whereabouts are going to be and how I can help assist him to get out of jail. And I ended up getting beaten and placed in handcuffs and booked. And it was a long weekend. So I spent the weekend in jail. And I got out, and they gave me a number of plea offers. And I'm like, I didn't do anything. I'm not going to take any of these pleas. Yeah. So I took it all the way to a jury trial. And I showed up for the jury trial. And prior to the trial beginning, they offered me an opportunity. They said, here's a citation for a $60 fine. If you sign the citation, we'll drop the charges. And I said, okay, that's fair enough. So, that was that experience then that I started taking these criminal justice classes that I was talking about. And then that's about a year and a half later, they had an advertisement in the local paper for jailers or correction officers in the very jail that I spent the weekend in. And kind of out of a joke, I went ahead and applied. And I got hired. So I now was working as a civil servant in the city jail that I had once sat there as an arrestee. Wow. So that was what kind of prompted me to go into law enforcement. And my father was a sociology professor, and I'd always considered being a teacher or a professor. And I kind of decided that I wanted to be a professor of criminal justice and follow my father into academia. But he really encouraged me at the point where it was time for me to start a PhD program, that I go get 5 years of law enforcement experience, practical experience in a large law enforcement agency. And he said my studies would be much more rewarding and I'd be a much more credible professor. So that's how I ended up out in Los Angeles. with the intent on policing no more than 5 years, and then going back and delving into my PhD program, which I never did. I stayed out there for 33 years.
Wow. So your father had this philosophy of learning through hardship. How did that influence how you later mentored others in law enforcement?
Well, I do believe that you have to learn oftentimes through hardship, hard learned lessons.
Hmm.
And as a leader, my leadership style was that I I really believe in providing my subordinates with the tools to be successful and have them be innovative and creative in developing the strategies and objectives on how we're going to be accomplishing the goals that we set for ourselves. Now, that being said, law enforcement is not a career where you can afford to allow people to make mistakes in real time in the streets while they're actively enforcing the law. So I provided all kinds of training opportunities, but is within those training opportunities that I allowed them the ability to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. And I felt that they, rather than teach them, this is how you do it, I wanted them to navigate that path on their own and allow them to make those mistakes in a controlled environment of training. So then not only did they learn from it, they understood the rationale for why we need to do it this way because they saw how the way that they initially were doing it in a controlled environment didn't work or it failed or what have you.
I had a supervisor, Jeff, very early on in my career, a commander who said, he goes, in a meeting that I had one on one with him, he says, I can accept a mistake of the heart. I can't accept a mistake of the mind. And that was his way of, hey, if you had good intentions and there wasn't something dubious about it, you were probably good to go. But if you went out there to beat somebody or you did something that was inappropriate, you were going to pay the price for that. And I found that as an interesting way of looking at it. And that was, he knew everybody makes mistakes as a cop. Every cop gets in a car accident. You know, you're going to get dinged for that. You might end up, getting accused of an inappropriate arrest, and then you just have to allow the process to identify what was right or what was wrong. So I found that as very helpful in my career. Obviously, that was something that you learned early on from your dad, and then continued in your careers as well.
Absolutely. I mean, my father gave me a number of tools that I didn't even realize that I was being given by him. They were gifts, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Was there a moment early in your LAPD career where you felt your unique path gave you a perspective others lack?
Well, really, my parents growing up in the environment that I grew up in with a multiracial family, where I was adopted, and then I had a brother who was adopted. He's Japanese, and I had a foster sister who was black. And growing up in the 60s and 70s in Kent, Ohio, it was very unique. And I just tended to have a little more insight than the average of mine in law enforcement relative to like the impact of micro racism, that sort of thing. Just because I saw it and I saw things at a very young age, and then even things that I saw when I was younger, I didn't quite understand at that time, but then it began to have meaning as I got older and better understood things because oftentimes things were done with the veneer of a smile. And it was really how things were said and stuff, but it really, I my parents always taught me, do the best you possibly can at everything you attempt to achieve. That was my philosophy in my hockey, and I carried that into law enforcement. And when I was in the academy, I started with the LA County Sheriff's Department. I did 3 years with them, and then I lateraled over to LAPD, where I did just over 30 years. And in the academy with the Sheriff's Department, I was driven, and I wanted to perform and be the best I possibly could be. When I took an examination, I studied, and my goal was to get 100%. And I kept myself at a real high physical condition. I took the time, having never fired a gun prior to going to the academy. I took the time and made the effort to learn the nomenclature and all of the basic principles of firearms marksmanship. And they have what's called the honor recruit, which is the number one recruit, and you're selected by not only academy staff but your peers. And we started with 157 people in the academy, and 107 graduated. So we lost about a third throughout the
Hmm.
process. And then I was recognized as the honor recruit. I graduated number one academically with like a 98.7%,
Wow.
number one physically, and number two in marksmanship. And what I used to hear from people, they used to tease me and laugh at me because they're like, why are you putting so much time into studying? All you need is a 70%, because that's all you needed to pass per the California police officer standard and training requirements. But that wasn't my goal. I was going to do the best that I possibly could do. And I just, I didn't see that that same mindset existed in many of my peers.
Yeah, it's like I never understood that. Well, all I got to do is get a 70. I never understood that. I mean, I that was something that was beyond. I'm like, I want to get the best score I can get. Why do I want to just meet standards? I want to exceed standards.
Right. But you know what? In my background, like in athletics, your performance, are you going to help the team win or not? And you better be at the top of your game. Well, law enforcement, the stakes are even higher. I mean,
You're talking about,
you're
yeah,
not paid for what you necessarily do on a daily basis. You're paid for what, God forbid, you may have to do. When you're confronted with that rapidly unfolding tactical scenario where you have to make split second decisions, and it could cost you your life or the life of a citizen. And if you're not prepared, then and you're not making yourself responsible for making sure that you're prepared, then I don't know if you're in the right line of work or not.
yep, yep. Jeff, you wrote about uh, them versus us mentality that was pretty prevalent even in the majority white college town that you were in. Have you seen that same mindset show up in larger urban police departments like LAPD?
Absolutely. It just, law enforcement at times can be quite insular. And it was my experience when I first started out in law enforcement in Los Angeles that you get into law enforcement and it's not long before you start hearing people say, if you're not in law enforcement, you don't matter. It's us law enforcement against the world. And then it's the LAPD against everybody else. And then it's 77th Division LAPD against everybody else. No, it's Morning Watch 77th Division LAPD against everybody else. And then it's not long before you're looking at your partner going, everybody else that's not sitting in this radio car are idiots. And it's you can really become that insular in your mindset about them versus us. So it's not only law enforcement against the citizens viewing them negatively, it's how law enforcement views itself and other agencies and how they work with other agencies. It's unbelievable. And it goes beyond just just some professional competition. It does go beyond that
Yeah.
that I saw. And really in today's environment, that's part of why law enforcement, I feel, has been stifled because during my decades in law enforcement, there are so many lessons that we learned in the LAPD because we made a lot of mistakes and we had to learn from them. We were under a Department of Justice consent decree for
Hmm.
10 years as a result of the significant mistakes we were making in our management of our specialized units and our applications of force and investigations of force and all those critical things that have to be on the ball on in law enforcement. And you continually, even to this day, see law enforcement agencies in this country making the exact same mistakes that we were making over 2 decades ago in Los Angeles. And it's unfortunate, but it's because it's such an insular mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeff, I'm sorry. You said the lieutenant who once beat you later tried to justify it. How did that shape your understanding of rationalization within police ranks?
It wasn't that, when you say justify it, that to me leads me one to believe that the person who's making the justification knows that they were wrong. I can't say that he felt that he was wrong. I think he really believed that he was, and he was sharing the rationale, not really a justification, but that he believed that rationale. And basically what he was saying that we have to deal with all these drunk college kids. And when we identify anybody that and we perceive could potentially escalate a situation, we have to make an example of them. And that's what I would suggest occurred with me. And for asking, you know, where my buddy was going to be taken and how much it was going to cost to get him out of jail. So I did see that throughout law enforcement. It's a slippery slope because it's like you have vehicle pursuits. Suspects bail out of the car. I saw force that wasn't justified at the termination of those things. And the mindset was it's about the end justifying the means. That this excessive force, we need to teach them not to run from us so they don't do it again. It's easy to justify that, but it's wrong. But
Yep,
you
I
feel like
agree.
you're in the right because it's to benefit the greater good, so to speak. It's a real slippery slope.
Yeah, it does open the door to things that people will do later on and that will be life changing in some cases. Jeff, in your book, you argue that we don't need just police reform. We need to reimagine the role of policing. What's the distinction in your view?
Police reform, that just that word alone, there's certain words relative to law enforcement, especially
Hmm.
right now with how critical everybody is of law enforcement, that that really do not have a positive connotation. And when you talk about police reform, you're those people that are actually doing the job, that word just shuts them down. And it's really about reimagining it and empowering those people that are in those roles to work with the collective group of community members and business members and things of that nature, people that are influential and can have ideas, because it's not about being right, it's about getting it right. And it requires that we have diverse thought and perspectives all shared. And it's then and only then that through those tough conversations and that dialogue that we're going to be able to and what the best path forward is going to be. And that's what reimagining is. And that's where law enforcement has the opportunity to really have, to dictate its future on its own. And my forthcoming book, On Thin Ice, I named it that not only because of my hockey background, but because I feel law enforcement is on thin ice to the extent that if we don't make some changes, they're going to be imposed on us. And
Yeah,
we don't want that.
and we're seeing this here where I'm my hometown, my home state, Illinois, where the legislation that they're putting in place, they don't even talk to policing, and especially the Illinois Chiefs Association, on what changes should be made. They decided several years ago to implement the Safety Act, and they said, "Well, we know there's things in here you're not going to agree with. We'll just later on we'll make the changes for that, but here's what you're going to get now." So they just jammed it down everybody's throats, and now they have to do some changes, and they have not yet done those, and it's been almost 6 years. So yeah, not a good way to make changes, right? Jeff, what do you see as the most urgent systemic change that's needed in U.S. policing today?
I think I kind of spoke about that a little bit earlier about the insular nature of law enforcement. We need to look outside of our boundaries in regards to what are some of the best practices in law enforcement. There's things that's being done in other countries that markedly is better than how we do things here in the United States.
Give me an example.
Well, the one thing, I talk in my book, I talk quite a bit about how we can improve in our recruitment and in our training. And, when it comes to how here in the United States we select law enforcement candidates, it's a deselection process. And so if you don't have a criminal record, your finances are in order, and you don't have too many tickets that you owe, you got a decent chance you'll get hired somewhere. And that's not the way it is in many other countries. It's not really about who we hire, but it's how we hire that we should be focusing on. Because, if you look at the Nordic countries, they have a training where it's like 2 and 3 years. It's the equivalent of an undergraduate degree. And what's occurring there is they're not only getting additional training far beyond what we get here. I mean, the average of police academy here in the United States is about 800 hours of training before you hit the streets. And you put that in context to get your a cosmetology license, all you need about 1,500 hours, which is about twice as many as you need to be a police officer on the streets. I mean, that's kind of crazy if you really put it in context. But the reality is while you're watching these people go through these training scenarios where they're getting some academic background stuff, but it's also the police application stuff, the proficiency in pugilistics and firearms and tactics and all those sorts of things. But you're assessing these candidates in regards to how well are they receiving the training, and do they possess empathy and critical thinking skills and problem solving skills, and are they self-aware? Are they able to self-regulate? All of those things that I don't think anybody would argue are characteristics that you need or are looking for in somebody that serves in law enforcement. So it's a very different dynamic, and they pay their people well. It's this is a profession, and it needs to be treated as one in regards to the education, the training, and the pay.
And I know, like in Germany, the way that they do it is you're in high school, and their version of high school. And high school is a good chunk of it. If you're going into law enforcement, is all the training end of it and the law enforcement, and then they do 3 years, 3 additional years in all the physical standards, the criminal law stuff, the defensive tactics, all those other things. So, really, an interesting difference in the way that we structure ours. You're right. That's a different. That's definitely a different way of reimagining just the recruitment process
Right.
as making it a profession.
There's a huge debate. People talk about, do we need more training? Which I would argue we absolutely need more training. And then we talk about the education, but you can't conflate the two. They're really separate things. Training is your competency. Do you have the skill set to be competent to perform the various functions that you may be required to perform while serving as a police officer in the communities that you serve? That's the first thing. But are you really suited for that? Do you have the competency? Not just the competency, but the um, what's the word I'm looking for? Really, it's
Temperament.
like, yeah. Yeah? Do you have the temperament? Do you have the makeup to be successful? Because what they show is like the training. You only receive what you're open to receiving. The training, you can be trained all day long, but that doesn't mean your training is going to fix anything. I mean, the reality is that culture eats training for breakfast. You
Hmm.
can, if your culture is not aligned with the training, culture is always going to win. And the
Absolutely.
culture is going to drive the behaviors and the actions and the decisions of the police, not the training. So education impacts that culture more significantly than actually the training does.
I agree with you on that. Yeah, absolutely. Jeff, you talk about Sir Robert Peel's principles in the book. Which of these do you think has been most forgotten or misapplied in modern American policing?
I'd say probably the ability of the police to perform their duties is dependent on the public's approval of their actions. We oftentimes hear law enforcement just let us do what we know how to do. And you have to step back and go, well, we serve the public and we're here for the public. And
Hmm.
for us to be effective, the public has to be accepting of what we are actually doing. And we can't just impose our authority on people without providing a rationale and explaining our position or the necessity for the types of actions that we are taking. And yes, there are going to be times where certain segments of society are going to be opposed to what's going on and what's occurring. But it's about the support of the vast majority of people and being willing, even when there is conflict and discussion about best practices, that you articulate what it is you're doing and why you're doing it.
Okay, that's good. I appreciate that. Jeff, you've seen officer involved shootings from the inside as a supervisor. What did the exposure teach you about how departments handle accountability for those actions?
Oftentimes, with the LAPD during the time that I was there, I had my hands in over 700 officer involved shooting and lethal force cases.
Holy cow.
And either writing Chief Bratton or Chief Charlie Beck's rationale that was submitted to the Honorable Board of Police Commissioners relative to their recommended findings for all officer involved shootings and lethal force cases, or when I became the officer in charge of the detective entity that investigated all officer involved shootings and lethal force cases, I saw the good, the bad, and the ugly. Due to the fact that in Los Angeles, we saw so many incidents, you could manage it in your sleep. The thing that much of law enforcement in the United States faces is that about 70% of all law enforcement agencies, police communities about the size of 10,000 people, they don't have the resources or the wherewithal or the experience levels that helps them manage most critically the post incident elements or aspects of these these critical community and police relationships that need to connect. And a lot of it deals with the dissemination of information and being transparent about what occurred. And it's about taking ownership and identifying the things that were done well, the things that could be done better, and then letting people be aware of what you're going to do to fix those things that could be done better. And you hold people accountable, not only on the boots on the ground, but if necessary, command level people. But it's really about understanding how you need to communicate with your communities in which you serve, and what impact certain information when released will have, or impact there will be if information isn't released. Because you have to control the narrative. You can't allow rumor and innuendo to run rampant. It's like a cancer, and it can destroy the community police relationships.
All right, so let me jump to this because this is one of the next questions I have is from a communication standpoint, what role does that PIO, how should they play in helping to keep public trust or build it, especially after an OIS?
Well, it's really not the communication begins long before the OIS even occurred. It's all about relationships. So you have to have relationships in these communities that you serve. Communicate relationships with neighborhood watch groups, with the churches, with business owners. And really, what's super powerful is if you have a PIO in uniform on camera giving a statement, and the citizens are going to watch that, they receive that very differently than perhaps you have a PIO that may not be in uniform, that may be having community members and leaders in the community standing to their sides, nodding in approval to what they're saying. It's reinforcing, it's encouraging the trust within the community that what is being said is accurate. And so it's about developing those relationships because everybody benefits when the information that's being given is transparent, and we increase the likelihood that it's going to be believed because it should be believed, and that the community as well as the police department is doing everything possible to manage this situation and get the information out as timely as possible. And that's huge. And I saw Chief William Bratton do that when he would address the media. He was masterful with the media. He would have those, the heavy hitters in the community standing alongside and they're nodding because and it's reinforcing. So people that are listening to that are going to receive it very differently.
I've always been an advocate of that, so I appreciate you reiterating that. Most departments do you believe most departments are transparent enough with the public after a controversial incident, or do they still need to make changes?
There needs to be a lot of changes. Oftentimes, especially like if we want to talk about officer involved shootings, there's things that you need to be considering, and then there's things that really aren't relevant to the shooting or the officer's justification for the shooting because they didn't know that at the time. I mean, how often do we hear perhaps the suspect's criminal record that wasn't known to the officer at the time, so it had no impact whatsoever on the decision to use lethal force, but it's being presented and it's fact. It's not that it's not accurate. You just have to question the optics of that because what is the intent or the purpose for actually providing that information in the context in which you're giving it? Is it to sway public opinion, to try to dirty up the suspect? So you really have to be self-aware and cognizant of those sorts of things. It's really important. You see that very often, and that always has kind of done my head in. I'm just kind of like it's just stepping off with the wrong foot in the initial communication with the public after one of these critical incidents.
Yeah. In your book, you mentioned it isn't about pointing fingers, it's about building something better. What's one concrete policy change that you think of would immediately improve police community relations?
It's not policy because, like I said earlier, culture trumps policy. You can have all these policies you want to have. If your culture's not aligned with that, then you're really having a problem. The one key thing that I would say that all law enforcement officers, even at the youngest period in their career development, they need to understand is that the measure of your law enforcement agency and really of society is how it treats its most vulnerable members and people in impoverished communities and people that feel marginalized, and how do you treat them, and how do you view them, and how do they perceive that they view you, or how you view both ways. It has to be a positive thing. And, you know, early in my career, I used to take the time to go into the projects down in the South Central and interact with the kids and throw the football with them. And because I looked very different than the community members they were growing up with, I knew they were being told, because they grew up in these gang infested areas, that the police were bad. And I took the time, when I had the time, to do that, not only to show them that I didn't see them as the enemy, but that they should not see me as the enemy, that I wasn't what people were probably likely telling them I was like. So, it's just really important that those sorts of things occur. And that's about the culture. That's about the mindset. That's about, do you see your role as a warrior, or are you a guardian? Are you there to protect and serve, or are you there to, just enforce laws? And it's
You bring up the guardian warrior mindset, and I I go back. This is probably now worked this 20 years over 9/11, and I remember that whole concept changed after 9/11. We were going to the warrior concept, and I think that is a had a big impact on how law enforcement does things, because our mission changed. It got broadened a little bit because of a terrorist attack, and um, the grand reality of it is we need to be the guardian, and that's always been my opinion. I was never big into the warrior mindset, because I think that itself becomes the us versus them.
it does, at least externally. We had, Congress passed thing back in the late 90s with it's the military acquisition program, where essentially the Pentagon can access military equipment and uniforms and things of that nature. Law enforcement could access that. And, we're talking about $390 million a year on average is being acquired by this program by law enforcement agencies. And it's interesting. I live in a community of about 4,100 people. These officers here, they're they're dressed like they're in Iraq, you know,
Yeah,
and it's
and they might have an MRAP in the department too, which is just mind boggling.
and the thing about it is, it's like people have to understand that the way you look is going to impact your mindset, and your mindset is going to dictate your beliefs and your attitudes, and it's those beliefs and attitudes that drive your judgment, your decisions, and your actions. So it all, like you said, it all is intertwined, and it's important that we understand the militarization of law enforcement and how that impacts how we actually treat the public.
Yeah, Jeff, what role do you see for young officers in driving the reimagining of law enforcement?
Biggest challenge, you said?
No, no, I said what do you see for young officers in driving this reimagining of law enforcement? What role do they play?
But they're the future, and it's the role is to be a critical thinker, to don't be satisfied with the status quo, ask questions, continually be looking for areas to improve upon, and drive that as the culture within the organization. And don't don't be dissuaded or discouraged or completely ignore conflict of opinion. Welcome it. It's about creative encounters. You want to be engaged in dialogue with people that don't see things the way you do. I
Yeah.
found that some of the greatest realizations I ever came to, and things that I was ultimately able to implement in law enforcement, were not my ideas or came from anybody that wore the blue suit or the badge. It was from somebody outside of law enforcement. And it's amazing what you can learn if you would just sit and listen and take down those those uh those borders that you have, or barriers between the community and academia and whatever you may see as the people that don't understand, and you just listen to what they have to say. And it's been my experience that it's generally not anything that one particular person says. It's kind of a morph of everything together, but it's something very different than where I was coming from. And you have
Right.
those aha moments. You're like, ah, okay. And we have to be willing to have those moments.
I as a supervisor, I years ago when I was newly a sergeant, one of the things that I would always do when an officer would come to me and say, "Okay, this is what happened," and I say, "Okay, well, what do you want to do?" And they were waiting for me to make the decision for them, and I said, "No, I want to hear what solution you're going to come up with, and then I'll tell you if policy wise we can or we can't, or if you've got a unique idea that might work." And that critical thinking, I think, was very important for them to pick up on because I think they learned a lesson from it.
Yeah. I used to find often that they would call you to a scene to run something by you that they knew wasn't quite in line with policy, but they wanted you to buy off on it. Because unfortunately, you have to have the strength as a supervisor to say, no, we're not going that route. And this is why. And unfortunately, there's too many supervisors that are afraid to do that because they want to be part of the good old boy group.
Yeah. Jeff, what advice would you give to a PIO or a law enforcement leader trying to lead change from within?
That it's by leading within, it's important to, like I've said, reach out to the outside. So your subordinates, expose them and normalize the activity of engaging in interactions with people outside of the organization. And I, when like if it comes to education, if you're on the job and you want to pursue an undergraduate degree, there are programs that you can do within the law enforcement program, but you're going to be going through those classes with other cops. Once again, it's rather insular. It's really interesting if you're the only cop that's sitting in that classroom. You can learn so much more in that type of environment than if you're just pursuing an education with just cops that are like-minded. And it's just about encouraging people to reach out. The outside is not a bad thing. The outside perspective, it's actually a good thing, and it'll keep you sharp. It'll keep you on your toes, and it'll keep you thinking. And it'll definitely make sure that you're self-aware of what's going on.
Excellent. Jeff, what do you hope this that your book on thin ice sparks in readers from officers to policymakers to the everyday citizen?
Well, I often get asked, who is your target audience for the book? And I said, that's a tough question, because I would say it's from the suburban housewife all the way to leaders in law enforcement and the officers that are out on the street doing the job every day, to legislators. But I think that regardless of who you are, that you're going to find the book enlightening. It's going to be empowering to the reader, and I think the readers will walk away feeling hopeful for the future. In that this is doable, and it's not a task that's going to be too large of a hardship. I don't for a second think that the actionable solutions that I suggest or I discuss in my book are the answers. I don't believe that I have all the answers. I just trying to initiate the dialogue of having those difficult conversations, honest conversations, so we can have some of these discussions that will navigate that path forward for law enforcement. I bleed blue. I want law enforcement to be successful. And I think at this point in modern day policing, that's really what's going to be required, is these tough conversations.
Right. Jeff, you chose the title on thin ice for two reasons. You said one because of your hockey background, and the other because you felt that policing is on thin ice with the way that they do things. In that context, of your career and this moment of policing, where do we go with this? Where do we go?
Well, it's about recognizing that there is a path forward and that we shouldn't be satisfied with the status quo and where we are in many aspects. It doesn't take long, or you don't have to look too far to find some catastrophic failures in law enforcement. One was just a year ago yesterday with the Secret Service. We arguably could say on January 1st of this year in New Orleans, when he had 14 people killed with the guy in the pickup truck. I mean,
Don't even get me started on that one.
these are all failures that it's about mindset and what you view as your role and what you're willing to accept as the standard that you're going to put forward in protecting the communities that you serve. And I could go on and on. Those are some of the nationally recognized ones, but there's other ones where we're just talking about officer involved shootings and things, and based on what I do with law enforcement consultants as the founder and CEO of that company, and the expert testimony stuff I do in court, that I'm aware of, that it's there's problems on a micro and a macro level in law enforcement, but we can really make a concerted effort as law enforcement professionals to make improvements moving forward to be successful in the 21st century.
Yeah, I agree. Jeff, where can listeners get your book on thin ice?
Well, it hasn't been released yet, but if you'd like to find out more information, you can go to onthinicebook.com, and there you can put in your email address, and you can be placed on the email list. And the book will be coming out later this summer, early fall. My marketing team hasn't determined exactly when it's going to be, but I understand there's a whole science to it. But
Oh yeah, no,
yeah,
I get it. All right, so what's next for you after this book? Are you engaging in any consultancy, advocacy, training work related to the issues you raised?
well, I'll be writing another book. I've started as a result of the process of going through writing this book, the frustrations I had with publishers. I started my own publishing company. It's called Populist Publishing. So if you're interested in that, you go to populistpublishing.com and you can see what that's all about. And it's people that are very similar to me that have very meaningful stories and things that can be learned from their experiences in law enforcement or in their military background or any type of first responder that want to have control of their voice and the process of having their book going from beginning to end all the way through the publishing process. I already have like 6 books in the line already.
Holy
Yeah,
cow.
mine's the initial. There's quite a desire because really what prevents people from doing this is they don't know where to begin. Just like I didn't. I plugged my nose and jumped. That's basically what I did, and it took me 2.5 years to get through it because I had to learn along the way. What's unique about what my publishing company offers, if you came to me, Robert, today and said, I want to write a book about this, but I don't know how to go about it, I've got various packages based on what it is you're going to need, where I have ghostwriters, copywriters, editors, formatters, all the way through the marketing team and the publishing that can walk you through the entire process.
Wow, that's outstanding to hear. Jeff, what's that website again?
Populistpublishing.com.
I make sure I put that in the show notes. Jeff, key points, key thoughts for today. What key points would you like the listeners to take from this interview with you today?
That law enforcement is not in a place where it needs to remain static, that there's room for improvement. And it's not just a law enforcement's problem, it's a societal problem here in the United States. And everybody has a role in this. But and I would say this, people need to be patient with law enforcement. They've got one of the most difficult jobs in the world, and they're the most highly criticized profession probably in the world. And the role that they serve takes a toll not only on them but on their families, and it's important that we're patient with them and that we see this as a collaborative group effort, and the answers are not in being critical, it's about coming up with solutions.
I like that. Thank you. As we wrap this up, is there a piece of wisdom or a motto that you live by?
Well, this comes back from hockey. You're only as good as your last shift.
No,
So
that's true.
it's
I like that. Jeff, how can people best reach out to you if they want to connect or follow up on anything that we've talked about today?
Well, you can go to jeffwenninger.com and you can learn more about the book as well as myself. And I have a fairly heavy presence on social media on LinkedIn and Facebook under Jeff Wenninger. And you can message me there. You can see the other things that I'm publishing and writing about. And you can kind of see what my vision moving forward is. And if you reach out to me, I respond back to everybody.
And I will add all that in the show notes. Jeff, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.